The storm rolled in off the Nebraska plains like something with a grudge, all black sky and sideways rain, and Elvira Carver had exactly two choices left to her: keep riding into the dark and likely lose her horse, or knock on the door of the only lit window she had seen in 40 miles. She knocked. The year was 1879, and the territory between Fort Kearny and the small town of Ridgecroft was not the kind of place a woman rode alone after nightfall. Elvira knew that better than most. She had been riding for 3 days, sleeping in short stretches beside her roan mare, Dolly, eating hardtack and dried beef from a canvas saddlebag that had belonged to her father before her. She was 26 years old, with dark hair that had come loose from its braid and now stuck to the back of her neck in wet ropes, and she had brown eyes that people sometimes mistook for soft, until she turned them on something that needed fixing. There was a great deal in the world that needed fixing, in Elvira's experience. The door opened after a long pause, and the man on the other side of it held a lantern up to her face with the careful wariness of someone who had learned the hard way not to answer doors without thinking first. Chester Norris was 32, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the bluffs behind his property. He had dark blonde hair that needed cutting and pale green eyes that caught the lantern light in a way that Elvira noticed, and then decided firmly not to think about again. He was in his work clothes, which meant he had not been sleeping, and there was a smear of grease on his left forearm and sawdust on the front of his shirt. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, when he is trying very hard not to show that he is surprised. "I am sorry to trouble you," Elvira said, because she believed in getting straight to the point. "My name is Elvira Carver. I am traveling to Ridgecroft and I misjudged the storm. I need shelter for one night for myself and my horse. I can pay you in coin or in work, whichever you prefer, but I need an answer now because my mare is soaking through." Chester looked past her at the horse standing in the rain, then back at Elvira. He opened the door wider. "Barn is around the back," he said. "Get your horse settled first, then come inside." It was not a warm welcome. It was not meant to be, but it was honest, and Elvira had learned to value honesty above warmth. She led Dolly around the side of the house, following the direction Chester had gestured, and found the barn by the sound of the other animals inside it. There were 2 draft horses, a mule, and 3 goats that regarded her arrival with philosophical calm. She rubbed Dolly down with a burlap sack she found hanging on a peg, checked her hooves, filled the water bucket from the pump inside the barn door, and forked hay into the stall with the efficiency of someone who had been doing such things since she was old enough to lift a pitchfork. It was only when she turned to leave the barn that she noticed the pump. It was a good pump, solidly built, but the leather gasket on the handle joint had dried and cracked, which meant the pump was losing pressure on every 3rd or 4th stroke. Whoever had installed it had done a fine job with the ironwork but had forgotten to oil the seal. Elvira looked at it for a moment, then looked around the barn for what she might need. She found a tin of bare grease on the shelf above the tool bench, beside a collection of leather scraps and a small awl. She worked quickly, loosening the joint, packing new grease into the seal, retightening everything with her hands, and then with a wrench she found hanging on a square nail. She tested it twice. The pump ran smooth, and even now, no more skip strokes. She set the wrench back on its nail, wiped her hands on the inside hem of her coat where nobody would see it, and walked to the house. Chester opened the door before she knocked, which meant he had been watching from the window. He said nothing about that. The house was small and clean in the way that things are clean when one person lives in them and takes care of them out of habit rather than out of any particular love for tidiness. There was a fireplace with a good fire going, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, a cast iron stove, and a narrow door that she assumed led to a bedroom. The floor was pine scrubbed. The curtains at the window were plain cotton faded from washing. "Sit down," Chester said, and he was already moving to the stove. "There is coffee from this evening. It is not fresh, but it is hot." "Thank you," Elvira said, and sat. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat down across the table with the other, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The rain hammered the roof. The fire cracked and shifted. Elvira wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth travel up her fingers. "Where are you coming from?" Chester asked. "Caldwell," she said. "Before that, Wichita." He studied her. "That is a long ride." "It is," she agreed. "What is in Ridgecroft?" Elvira considered how much to say and decided on the truth, because she was tired and the truth was simpler. "My mother's sister passed in June. She left a house and a piece of land to my mother, but my mother is not able to travel. She has been ill for 2 years now. I am going to assess the property and either settle it or sell it on her behalf. I have a letter of authorization from my mother and a copy of the deed." Chester nodded slowly. He did not ask further questions about her situation, which she appreciated. "You can sleep by the fire," he said. "I do not have a spare room, but the floor is good and I have a blanket I can spare." "That is more than enough," Elvira said. "I told you I could pay in work, I mean it. You do not need to do that." "I know I do not need to," she said evenly. "I want to, it is the way I was raised." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the possibility of one. "All right," he said. "We can talk about it in the morning." He gave her the blanket, which was thick wool and smelled of cedar, and he banked the fire so it would hold until dawn, and he disappeared through the narrow door to his room. Elvira stretched out on the floor in front of the fireplace with her coat over the blanket for extra warmth, and listened to the storm wind itself down outside. She had slept in worse places. She had slept in rain and once in a partially collapsed outbuilding with a family of raccoons. The pine floor of Chester Norris's house, with a good fire and coffee in her stomach, felt something close to luxurious. She lay awake for a while, looking at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. It was a well-built house. She could tell from the way it sat against the wind, barely a whistle coming through the frames. Someone had put care into it. But she had noticed, when she sat down at the table, that the left rear leg of her chair was slightly shorter than the others, so that, when she shifted her weight, it rocked with a small but persistent clunk that would drive a person half-mad over time. And she had noticed, too, that the damper on the fireplace was not quite catching, because there was a faint tendril of smoke curling back into the room instead of drawing cleanly up the chimney. Elvira was not the sort of woman who could notice something broken and leave it alone. She waited until she was certain Chester was asleep. Then she got up, the fireplace damper first. She crouched before it, studying the mechanism by the light of the fire. The damper plate had worked loose from its pivot, just slightly, enough that it sat at a small angle instead of flat. She pressed it back into its seat, testing it twice, feeling the satisfying click as it caught properly. The thin curl of smoke disappeared. The fire drew the way it should. Then the chair. She picked it up and turned it over, examining the legs in the firelight. Just as she had thought, the left rear leg had been replaced at some point, probably after a break. But the replacement was cut just a hair too short, maybe a 1/4 inch. She looked around the room in the dim light, moving carefully, and found his toolbox near the door where she had seen him set it earlier. Inside, in a small compartment, were several wooden shims cut for exactly this kind of purpose. She chose one, trimmed it with his folding knife to the right thickness, and wedged it carefully under the leg. She set the chair down, pressed on each corner in turn. Solid. No rock. She had been awake for what felt like 2 hours, though it was probably less. She went back to her blanket and lay down. She was almost asleep when she heard it. The sound was small but wrong, the particular tick-hand drip of water finding a gap in a roof. She lay still and located it by ear. The corner behind the bookshelf. She could see, when she looked, the faint dark stain spreading on the ceiling plank and a small bead of water forming at the joint between 2 boards. It had not yet dripped to the floor, which meant it was new, probably opened up by the storm tonight. But it would drip by morning, and if it dripped onto those books it would ruin them. She looked at the books for a moment. There were perhaps 30 of them, some with cracked spines and worn covers, the kind of books that had been read more than once. She moved them carefully, 2 armloads, setting them on the table well clear of the leak, and then she found a bucket in the corner near the stove and positioned it under the spot where the water was beginning to form. It caught the first drop with a soft, clear ring of sound that settled into the quiet of the house like a small bell. Elvira looked at the bucket, looked at the ceiling, and thought that she would mention the roof in the morning. She lay down again, and this time she slept. She woke at dawn to the sound of Chester's boots on the floor, and the smell of coffee already made. She sat up, and he was standing by the stove looking at the chair, and then at the fireplace, and then at the bucket beneath the stain on the ceiling, and then at his book stacked neatly on the table. He stood very still for a long moment, holding his coffee cup. Elvira stood up and folded the blanket. "You fixed the pump," Chester said. He said it as a statement, not a question. "It was losing pressure," Elvira said. He looked at her. "And the chair?" "1/4 inch short on the left rear leg." "There was a shim in your tool box." He looked at the fireplace. "The damper. The pivot plate was loose. It is fine now." He set his coffee cup down on the table very slowly. Outside, the storm was gone, and the morning was clear and gold and washed, and the light came through the window at a low angle and lay in bright strips across the scrubbed floor. Chester looked at Elvira Carver standing in the middle of his main room with her hair still half undone from its braid and her coat slightly rumpled and her eyes steady and entirely unself-conscious about what she had done. He said, "I have eggs and salt pork. Will you eat before you go?" Elvira looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "thank you." They ate at the table that now had 4 even legs, in front of the fireplace that now drew clean and straight, and the bucket caught the slow drip from the ceiling with a patient ring every 30 seconds or so, and neither of them spoke much, but neither of them felt the need to. There was a quality to the silence between them that was neither awkward nor forced. It was the silence of 2 people who were comfortable with quiet. After the plates were cleared, Chester said, "I have to go up and patch that roof today before the next rain comes. The storm must have worked loose a shingle." Elvira said, "I can help you." He looked at her. "You are going to Ridgecroft." "Ridgecroft will still be there this afternoon," she said. "It is only another 12 miles and the road will be muddy after last night. I would rather wait for the ruts to dry some. And your roof needs 2 people, one on the ladder and one handing shingles." Chester was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They went up on the roof together once the sun had warmed the shingles to something less than treacherous. Chester had a head for heights and moved on the pitched surface with the ease of a man who had done this before. Elvira stayed on the ladder and handed up shingles and nails as he called for them, and she watched him work. He was good with his hands. Deliberate and careful, not fast but never wasteful of emotion. The kind of skill that did not need to announce itself. From the ladder, looking out, she could see the whole of his property laid out in the morning light. It was perhaps 320 acres, she guessed, with a good creek line along the east edge that would give year-round water. The fields were not yet broken for planting, but someone had clearly been thinking about it. There were fence posts driven along 2 sides, waiting for wire. The barn was well maintained. The house had been built on a slight rise, which was smart, because it put it above the flood plain of the creek without being exposed on a ridge. It was good land, handled by someone who thought carefully about what he was doing. She said without really planning to, "How long have you been here?" "4 years," Chester said, pressing a shingle down and setting a nail with practiced taps. "Came up from Kansas after the cattle drives played out, decided I was done following other men's herds." "You drove cattle 3 seasons," he said. "Enough." He glanced down at her. "Long dust and short pay and somebody always trying to prove something." "I wanted land that was mine." Elvira handed up another shingle. "It is good land." "Yes," he said. He said it quietly, like a man confirming something he had said to himself many times alone, and was not accustomed to saying aloud. They worked for 2 hours on the roof and came down when the patch was tight and tarred, and Chester was satisfied it would hold. Elvira went to check on Dolly while Chester cleaned up, and she found the mare rested and bright-eyed and clearly of the opinion that she had been treated very well. Elvira laughed at her a little, pressing her face against the mare's nose, and felt something in her chest that she recognized as the reluctance to leave. She stood in the barn doorway looking out at the land, with the creek glinting in the distance and the sky so clean after the rain that it looked like it had been washed too. Chester came out of the house and crossed the yard toward her. "I want to pay you," Elvira said. "I told you I would." "You already fixed 3 things before sunrise," Chester said. "I think we are more than even." "Those were small things," she said. "To you, maybe," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite agreement. Elvira looked at him. He was looking at the land, not at her, with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back on his head. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Do you have anyone helping you, on the land I mean, with all of this?" He shook his head. "No, that is a lot of work for one person." "It is," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. "Why have you not hired on?" He cut a look at her a little sideways. "Money is tight after the winter. I had 2 steers lost to a wolf pack in February, and the cost of replacing them ate through what I had put by for spring labor." He paused. "I am telling you more than I mean to." "That happens to people around me," Elvira said, without any particular pride in it, just as a statement of fact. He looked at her again fully this time, and she looked back at him, and the morning held still around them. "You should get to Ridgecroft," he said, "before the afternoon dries the road and the ruts bake hard." "Yes," Elvira said, "I should." She saddled Dolly, and Chester held the mare's head while she mounted, and she took up the reins and looked down at him. "Thank you for the shelter," she said, "and the eggs." "You are welcome for both," he said. "Your pump will run good now for another year at least," she said. "After that, check the gasket again." Something flickered in his expression, something warm and complicated that he controlled quickly. "I will remember that," he said. She rode out through the gate and down the track toward the main road, and she told herself not to look back, so she did not. She thought about his bookshelf the whole 12 miles to Ridgecroft. Ridgecroft was a town of about 400 souls in 1879, which made it neither small enough to be overlooked nor large enough to feel like anything other than a collection of buildings that had agreed to stand near each other for company. There was a main street with a general store, a post office, a livery, a doctor, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, and a church at the end of the street that looked like it had ambitions of being larger. Elvira arrived in the early afternoon, got Dolly settled at the livery, took a room above the saloon, and went directly to the land office to find out about her aunt's property. The clerk at the land office was a man named Horace Blevins, who wore eyeglasses on the end of his nose and had the particular kind of organized clutter that suggested a very sharp mind inside a moderately chaotic workspace. He found the deed for her mother's inherited property in less than 3 minutes, which impressed her, and spread it out on the counter. The property was 11 acres on the south edge of town, with a house, a small barn, a working well, and a kitchen garden that had apparently run itself wild since June. Elvira looked at the papers, asked several precise questions, and left with a copy of the relevant documents tucked under her arm. She found the house on the south road, exactly where the map said it would be. It was a small clapboard house with a sagging porch and a window with a broken pane that had been stuffed with a rag. The garden was indeed wild, with tomato plants sprawling across the path and squash vines taking over the front fence. The well rope had frayed almost through. The barn latch was broken, which was why the barn door stood open at an angle, swinging in the afternoon breeze. Elvira stood in the path with her hands on her hips and looked at all of it, and felt the familiar feeling move through her. Not dismay, exactly. More like the particular satisfaction of a person who knows what needs doing and is not afraid to do it. She spent the rest of the afternoon making an inventory. She walked every room of the house, noting what was structurally sound and what was merely aesthetic damage. She tested the floor joists, pressed on the walls, checked the chimney draw, looked at the roof from the outside and the attic from within. She wrote everything down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Then she went back to town, bought rope at the general store, and repaired the well rope before dark. That night, eating supper at the saloon, she sat alone at a corner table with her notebook and made two lists. One was the list of repairs needed to make the property sellable for a fair price. The other was the list of repairs needed to make the property livable. The second list was not much longer than the first, which told her something. She went asleep thinking about her mother's health, about the long ride back to Wichita, about the property documents, about the 11 acres with the wild garden and the sagging porch. And she thought briefly, without quite meaning to, about a bookshelf with 30 well-read books, and a man who looked at his own land like it was something he had promised himself. She was in Ridgecroft for 5 days. She accomplished a great deal in those 5 days. She met with a local attorney named Perkins who confirmed her mother's title was clean. She had the broken window pane replaced by the town glazier. She repaired the porch railing herself with lumber from the hardware man. She found a neighbor woman named Mrs. Aldred who had been keeping an informal eye on the property and who knew the history of every fence post on the South Road, and who also, it turned out, knew Chester Norris by name. Chester Norris, Mrs. Aldred said, over coffee in Elvira's aunt's kitchen, which Elvira had cleaned until it met her standards. "I know that man. Good man. Came through here 2 winters ago with a wagon load of corn he sold below price because the Hoback family had lost everything to a fire in November and needed the help. He did not make any talk about it, just did it. People notice things like that." Elvira was quiet for a moment. "Does he come to town often?" "Often enough," Mrs. Aldred said, watching her with old, bright eyes. "Saturdays, usually, for the general store and the post office. Sometimes he takes supper at the saloon," said Elvira, and wrote something in her notebook that had nothing to do with the property. She did not allow herself to ride back past his property on her way out of town when she finally left. She took the main road north, which added an extra 4 miles, but kept her from doing something she had not yet decided whether she wanted to do. She made it as far as the junction, 12 miles out of Ridgecroft, where the North Road split from the East Road, and she sat there on Dolly in the afternoon sun with her notebook in her saddlebag, and her conscience having a vigorous argument with her better judgment. The property was livable, with about 2 weeks of work. It was her mother's property, so it was ultimately her mother's decision to sell it or keep it or let someone use it. But her mother was ill in Wichita and could not travel, and a letter would take 3 weeks round trip, and the property needed someone to look after it or it would continue deteriorating. And if it deteriorated, it would be worth less when the time came to sell, and that was a practical concern with a practical solution. The practical solution was that someone should stay and look after it. Elvira was good at practical solutions. She turned Dolly north and kept riding, but she could not stop herself from thinking, for the next 4 hours, about what it would be like to wake up in the small clapboard house and look out the kitchen window at the wild garden in the morning light. She wrote to her mother from the next town, a place called Horn Creek, where she stopped for the night. She laid out the situation honestly and in full detail, the way she always did, and she proposed her solution, which was that she should go back to Ridgecroft and spend some weeks putting the property in proper order before making any decision about selling. She said that the land was good, and the house was sound at its bones, and that it would be foolish to sell at present conditions price, when a modest investment of labor would bring a significantly better return. Her mother wrote back, 3 weeks later, in a shaky hand that tore at Elvira's heart, to say that she trusted Elvira's judgment entirely, and would she please do what she thought was best, and also to tell her that she was looking much better lately and the doctor was cautiously optimistic. Elvira was in Horn Creek for those 3 weeks. She had taken a job with the town doctor as a general assistant, because she was not the kind of woman who could sit still waiting for mail, and she was good at doctoring in the practical sense, which is to say the kind that happens outside a doctor's office. She helped the doctor, a tired man named Fenwick, with whatever he needed, which turned out to include not only medical assistance, but also the complete reorganization of his record-keeping system, which had gotten so tangled over 10 years that he could not reliably find anything. Elvira reorganized it in 4 days, which made Fenwick nearly weep with gratitude and offer her a permanent position. She thanked him and said she would think about it. She thought about it for approximately 2 minutes, and then she rode back to Ridgecroft. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and on Saturday morning she was at the general store buying lumber and paint, and a new set of hinges for the barn door when she heard a voice behind her that she recognized with a certainty that surprised her. She turned around. Chester Norris was standing in the aisle behind her, holding a paper in one hand, and looking at a shelf of hardware with the particular expression of a man who has come in for one thing and is being made to choose between 3. He had not seen her yet. He was wearing a clean shirt which was different from the work-stained one she had seen him in before, and his hair had been cut since she had seen him, though it was still somewhat overlong. He looked in the morning light of the general store like exactly what he was, a careful, capable man standing in an aisle trying to make a sensible decision. Elvira said, "The middle weight. It will take the weather better." Chester turned. He looked at her for a long moment in which several things happened in his expression that he managed not to put into words. Then he said, "You came back. I own property here now," she said. "Or my mother does. I am looking after it." He looked at the lumber she was holding. "That is a lot of wood for looking after. The porch needs rebuilding," she said, "and the barn door." He took the lumber from her hands, not asking, just adjusting it so he was carrying the heavier end, and they walked to the counter together. She did not ask him why he had taken the lumber. He did not explain. They paid for their separate purchases and walked out into the bright Saturday morning together, and he helped her load her wood into the cart she had hired from the livery. And when she straightened up and looked at him, he was watching her with that expression she had first seen at his door in the storm, the one that was too careful to be a smile but was something adjacent to it. "My west fence line needs stringing," he said. "I put in the posts before the winter, but I never got to the wire." "That is not a one-person job," she said. "No," he agreed. There was a silence. "I could come out on Monday," she said. "I will have the porch boards cut by then, and I will need them to dry sit before I nail them, which means I will have a free morning." "Monday is good," Chester said. She drove the lumber cart back to the South Road, and she sat for a moment in front of her aunt's house before she got down, looking at the wild garden in the late morning sun, and she was smiling at nothing, and she allowed herself to do it for exactly 30 seconds before she climbed down and got to work. She fixed the porch over the next 2 days, which was good, steady work. She took the boards up in order, numbered them on the back in pencil, inspected each one, replaced the 5 that were soft with rot, restacked the good ones to air, and spent Sunday afternoon rebuilding the frame underneath where 2 joists had gone soft. By Sunday evening, the frame was solid and she could walk across it without any sway. She worked until dark, eating supper late and cooking it herself over the kitchen stove, which she had coaxed back into proper working order on her first day. She liked cooking. She liked the simplicity of it, the clear relationship between cause and effect. If you used good ingredients and paid attention, the food was good. If you did not, it was not. The world would be a simpler and more honest place, Elvira often thought, if more of it operated on this principle. She slept well and woke before dawn on Monday with a feeling that she recognized, after some private consideration, as anticipation. She rode out to Chester's property in the mid-morning with the sun already warm on her back, and the mud from last week's storm dried to a hard corrugation in the road. She found Chester at the west fence line, which ran along the top of a shallow draw, with a coil of barbed wire and a pair of leather gloves and a fence-stretching tool she recognized as one of the better quality ones, the kind that cost twice what the cheap ones did and lasted 4 times as long. He looked up when she rode in and tied Dolly to a fence post, and the simple act of him stopping what he was doing and turning fully toward her, giving her his complete attention, was something she felt in a way she had not entirely expected. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she replied. They worked the fence line together from mid-morning until early afternoon, which is to say they worked for about 4 solid hours, and the conversation between them was the kind that grows up naturally between two people who are doing something with their hands and are not trying too hard to talk. It happened in pieces. He told her more about the cattle drives, not the romance of them that people like to write about in newspapers, but the actual reality, which was dust and monotony, and the constant low-grade danger of animals that weighed 1,000 pounds and did not particularly care about the plans of the people trying to move them. She told him about her father, who had been a carpenter and a practical man who had believed, as a matter of deep conviction, that a person who could not fix what broke around them was at the mercy of the world in a way that was uncomfortable and unnecessary. "He taught you," Chester said. "Everything he knew," she said. "He used to say that a woman who knew how to fix a pump and set a window and read a deed was a woman who could go anywhere." He was right, Chester said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was pulling the wire tight with the stretcher, watching the tension come up, but the words were simple and without any particular inflection other than sincerity, and it was the sincerity that landed. She made a small sound that was not quite agreement, because she was not good at receiving directness, only at giving it. They finished the fence line by early afternoon and stood back and looked at it. It ran straight and tight from the corner post to the creekside stake, and the wire was even and the posts were plumb, and it was the kind of work you could be genuinely satisfied with. "Good fence," Elvira said. "Good help," Chester said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the draw was quiet around them with the sound of the creek below and the wind in the grass and nothing much else. He said, "Come back and eat supper. I have a decent stew on the back of the stove." "I have work at the house," she said, which was true. "You also have to eat," he said, which was also true. She went home, did 2 hours of work, then rode back to his place for supper. The stew was more than decent. It was good. She said so, with the same directness she applied to everything, and he looked briefly pleased in the way of a person who does not receive compliments often and is slightly unsure what to do with one. They sat at the table after the dishes were cleared, with coffee and the lantern between them, and talked for 2 hours. She could not afterward account for all of what they talked about. Books, because she asked about his shelf and he had opinions, which she had suspected he would. The state of the territory, which was changing fast, and which they both felt about with mixed emotions. The opening of land that had once been other people's land. The towns going up on the plains like mushrooms after rain. The railroads threading through country that had never had a wheel on it before. She knew enough history to understand that what was called progress in one set of newspapers was called something else entirely, by the people whose world was being remade around them without their consent, and she said so plainly, and he listened to her with a quality of attention that was not agreement exactly but was genuine and careful. He said, "My grandmother was half Osage. She used to say that the land did not belong to anybody. That people belonged to the land if they were lucky, and the best you could do was be worth what it gave you." Elvira was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like a remarkable person." "She was," Chester said. "She died when I was 11. But I still think about what she said, when I am working." It was full dark by the time Elvira rode home, and the stars over the Nebraska plains were the kind of extravagant that you forget about if you have been living in a town. She rode slowly, looking up, with Dolly walking easy on the familiar road, and she felt something in her chest that was large and warm and not entirely comfortable, the way it is with feelings that have gotten more significant than you originally planned for them. She was going to have to think about this. She was not afraid of thinking. She was very good at thinking. But she was less practiced at thinking about this particular category of thing, because she had not, since she was 21, and had made a large error in judgment involving a man in Wichita who had turned out to have two simultaneous opinions about his future, allowed herself to get to this point. She got home, unsaddled Dolly, brushed her in the dark by habit, and went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and her notebook. She did not write anything for a long time. Then she wrote, "He is a good man," and then she closed the notebook and went to bed. The weeks that followed had a shape to them that felt both ordinary and extraordinary, the way the best parts of life often do. Elvira worked on the house most mornings, because there was still the barn door and the kitchen garden to bring to order and two windows whose frames had swollen and needed planing. And then there was the question of the interior, which was livable but would be better with fresh whitewash on two walls and a new piece of stovepipe where the old one had rusted through. She went to town on Tuesdays for supplies. She had taken a small paid position with the attorney Perkins, who needed someone to write clear, organized summaries of land documents, which turned out to be something she was very well suited for. And she went to Chester's on Saturdays. That was how it started, on Saturdays, because that was when he was in town, and sometimes they would see each other at the store and fall into walking together naturally, and she might stay for supper, or he might come and see the progress on the property and end up fixing the barn door alongside her because 4 hands were plainly better than 2. Then it became Wednesdays as well, then a Tuesday here and there. He helped her build the porch railing. She helped him when 2 of his goats got out through a fence gap and were found in the Aldred family's kitchen garden, which required not only the retrieval of the goats but a long and diplomatic conversation with old Mrs. Aldred, which Elvira handled so skillfully that Mrs. Aldred ended up sending them home with a jar of preserved peaches and an opinion that Chester Norris needed a wife. Chester went red at that and did not look at Elvira for most of the ride back, and Elvira was very quiet, and the goats in the wagon bed behind them were entirely unbothered. That evening at his place, when she was pulling on her coat to leave, he said her name. She turned. He was standing by the fireplace, and the fire was behind him, and he had his hands in his pockets in the way he did when he was working up to saying something he had thought about a lot. "I do not want you to go yet," he said. She looked at him. "Why not?" she said, and it was not really a question. "Because I would rather you stayed," he said, "and because I have been thinking about saying that for about 6 weeks and I am tired of not saying it." Elvira stood very still for a moment. The fire cracked behind him. The night was still outside. "Chester," she said, "I fixed your pump and your chair and your fire damper the first night I was here, and you never asked me to leave." He said nothing, just watched her. "I keep coming back," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not the behavior of a person who plans to leave," she said. He took his hands out of his pockets. "No," he said, "it is not." She hung her coat back on the hook by the door. "Then make more coffee," she said, "and tell me what else is on your mind." He made the coffee. He told her what was on his mind. It took a while because he was not a man who spoke easily about interior things, but he was honest, which was better than easy. He told her that in 4 years on this land he had built something he was proud of, but that there were mornings when the silence of the house was not peace, but just absence, and that he had started to notice the difference more since she had come. He told her that he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and that what he was saying now was that she mattered to him in a way that had become the central fact of most of his days. Elvira listened to all of it without interrupting, which for her was an act of significant discipline. When he was done, she said, "I have not been in Ridgecroft because of the property." He looked at her. "I mean I have," she said. "The property is real and it needs work. But I rode past the junction on the North Road, and I turned around, Chester. And the reason I turned around was not the fence posts or the porch railing. He was across the room, and then he was not across the room, and he took her face in both hands the way a man handles something precious that he has wanted for a long time and been afraid to want. And she kissed him with the same directness she brought to everything else in her life. And the fire snapped behind them, and the Nebraska night settled around the house, and neither of them said anything for a while. When they did talk again, it was late, and they were sitting at the table with cold coffee and the lantern burning low, and they talked about practical things the way people in love who are also sensible people tend to do, because the world is not only feelings but is also made of days and decisions and plans. She told him about her mother. He told her about the land, the 400 acres that he was building toward, the cattle he wanted to run on the east field once the fence was finished. They talked about what staying would look like for her, about the property on the South Road, and what her mother might decide about it. They talked about what his grandmother had said about belonging to the land, and Elvira thought about the wild kitchen garden and the creek she could see from the porch, and the way the light came through the window in the mornings, and she thought she understood what that meant now in a way she had not before. He asked her, at the end of the evening, very carefully, if she would consider not going back to Wichita, or going, but coming back. She told him she would give him an answer in the morning. She went home and sat with her lamp and her notebook, and this time she did right. She wrote for an hour in her clear, organized way, making lists and thinking through things the way she always did, and at the end of it she sat and looked at what she had written and felt a stillness come over her that she recognized as certainty. She wrote one more line at the bottom of the last page. It said, "I am already home." She wrote to her mother the next morning, a long letter, the longest she had written in years. She told her about Chester, about the property, about Ridgecroft. She told her about the pump and the chair and the fire damper, and how he had never asked her to leave. She told her about the fence line and the stew and the bookshelf and Mrs. Aldred and her borrowed opinion about Chester needing a wife. She told her mother that she was happy in a way that was not the familiar feeling of a problem solved, but something different, something she thought her mother, who had loved her father for 22 years until the influenza took him, would recognize. Her mother wrote back in less than 2 weeks, which meant she had answered the same day the letter arrived, and the letter said simply, "Elvira, my love, I never did think you were coming back to Wichita, and I mean that as the finest thing I have ever said to you. Tell me about him." The autumn came on strong and golden in the way that the Nebraska autumn did, with the cottonwoods going yellow along the creek, and the sky taking on that deep blue that seemed almost to ring if you looked at it in the morning. Elvira was spending most of her time at Chester's by now, going back to the South Road house only to keep it in order, and to sit with Perkins on his twice-weekly document work. Chester had taken to building something in the barn in the evenings, which he was secretive about in a way that was not quite secretive enough, since Elvira had excellent peripheral vision and had already identified 2 pieces of curved wood that were the legs of a chair. She did not ask him about it. She waited. The chair appeared one morning on the porch beside the door. It was a rocking chair, wide-seated and well-made, with a particular curve to the back rail that was not just functional but beautiful. She stood and looked at it for a long time. He came out of the house behind her with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the porch rail beside her and sat on the step. She sat in the chair. It fit her exactly right. She said, "This is a good chair." "I measured it right," he said. "How did you know how to measure it right?" she said. "I watched you sit for long enough," he said, simply and without embarrassment. Elvira was quiet for a while, rocking gently in the morning light. "Chester," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would very much like to marry you," she said. A silence went by. "That is supposed to be my question to ask," he said. "I know," she said, "but I got there first." He was laughing, a quiet sound, the laugh of a man who is genuinely surprised into happiness. He put his coffee down and stood up and looked at her in the rocking chair on his porch in the morning light of the golden autumn, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. "Then yes," he said, "I would very much like to marry you too." She reached up and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stayed like that for a while, on the porch, while the cottonwoods blazed yellow down by the creek, and the light moved slow and bright across the land. They were married in November, in the Ridgecroft church that had ambitions of being larger, on a clear, cold day when the sky was the kind of blue that rings. Perkins stood up for Chester, and Mrs. Aldred stood up for Elvira, because she had no family here and Mrs. Aldred had firmly appointed herself to the role the moment she heard about the engagement, and nobody had thought to argue with her. The ceremony was conducted by the pastor, a young man named Whitfield who was earnest and kind and nervous in the way of young men presiding over things for only the second or third time. And he read from the Bible, and he spoke about the obligations of marriage, and Elvira thought that she agreed with most of what he said, which was more than she usually managed when someone was speaking at length. Chester held her hand during the whole of it and looked at her at the moment of the vows with such direct and steady feeling that she had to look down for a moment, not because she was ashamed, but because she needed a second to get herself collected. She looked up and said her vows in a clear, carrying voice, and he said his in the quiet, certain way that she had learned was how he sounded when he meant something most. Mrs. Aldred cried. She had brought a handkerchief for the purpose and used it thoroughly. After the ceremony there was a supper at the saloon, because Ridgecroft had few large spaces and the saloon was the largest of them, and the whole town came more or less, because Ridgecroft was the kind of town where a wedding was a collective event. Elvira met people she had not met, which turned out to include a pair of brothers named Kessler who had the neighboring property to the north of Chester's land, and a woman named Ruth Fontaine who ran the millinery and had views on everything, and expressed them with an enthusiasm that Elvira privately admired. Chester stood beside her all evening, steady as a fence post, and when she got tired of talking, which she did eventually, because she was fundamentally a private person even if she was not a timid one, he found the moment and said the right thing, and they slipped out into the cold November night together. She took his arm on the walk back to where the horses were, and he put his hand over hers on his arm, and they walked in the kind of silence that is full rather than empty. She had written to her mother that morning, a short letter just to tell her it was today. Her mother's response, which she had received the week before and already had memorized, had said, "Be happy, my love, be brave, take care of each other. I will come in the spring when I am stronger." Her mother came in the spring. She came on the train as far as the rail end, which was 30 miles from Ridgecroft, and Chester drove out to collect her in the wagon with Elvira beside him, and they found her mother sitting on a bench outside the rail station in the early morning sun, a small woman with white hair and Elvira's eyes, looking around at the plains with the expression of someone taking thorough inventory. Her mother looked at Chester for a long time when they got down from the wagon, with Elvira's hand in hers, and Chester stood still under it with the steady quality that Elvira had come to love. Her mother said, "You have a good face." Chester said, "Thank you, ma'am." Her mother said, "She fixed things for you," Chester said, 3 things before morning, and she never stopped. Her mother smiled, and it was Elvira's smile exactly, the one that arrived without announcement and meant more than it looked like it meant. She said, "Then I believe you already know each other as well as some people manage in a lifetime." The spring was a full and growing thing. Her mother spent 2 months in Ridgecroft, staying at the South Road house, which was now fully repaired and clean, and had the wild garden brought to order enough to be beautiful without being tamed, because Elvira had decided she liked the kitchen garden with some of its wildness left in. Her mother proved to be exactly the kind of person who found Ridgecroft interesting rather than small, which meant she found friends quickly, particularly Mrs. Aldred, and the two of them spent significant amounts of time in each other's kitchens, which Elvira found both amusing and touching. Chester got along with her mother naturally, because they were both plain-spoken people who said what they meant, and her mother had an eye for good land and looked at Chester's 400 acres with the appreciation of someone who understood what it represented. She walked the fence line he and Elvira had strung together and said it was good work, and Chester said that Elvira had done half of it, and her mother said she knew, because that was the kind of thing Elvira did. Elvira listened to this exchange from 15 feet away while she was checking on Dolly and pretended she could not hear it. She could hear all of it. She felt a great deal. Her mother went back to Wichita at the end of May, on the train, with promises to return in the autumn if her health allowed, and a jar of Mrs. Aldridge's preserved peaches and a letter from Elvira to be read on the journey. They stood on the platform at the rail end station and watched the train go, and Elvira kept her composure in the way she had learned, which was to hold very still and breathe evenly, and Chester stood beside her and did not say anything for a while, and then he said, "She will be back." "I know," Elvira said. "She is a strong woman," he said. "Yes," Elvira said. "She is where I learned it." He took her hand as they walked back to the wagon and kept it the whole drive home. Summer came in hot and long, and Elvira spent it in 3 different modes that divided her days with a satisfying clarity. There was the house, which she continued to improve by small degrees, because there was always something that could be better, which Chester accepted as simply the condition of being married to Elvira, and which he had, she noticed, stopped trying to do before she noticed it needed doing. There was the work with Perkins, which had expanded now to include some bookkeeping for 2 of the larger ranch operations in the county, because word had gotten around that Elvira Norris, as she was now known, was precise and reliable, and had never been caught making the same mistake twice. And there was the land. The land was the thing she had not quite expected, how much she would come to love it. She had always been practical about land. She could read a deed and assess a property, and tell you what the soil was likely to do based on what was already growing in it. But to belong to a particular piece of land, to know its specific sounds and its particular light at different hours, to know where the ground went soft after rain and where the creek bent, and what the wind sounded like in the big cottonwood near the east fence, that was different. That was the thing her mother-in-law had talked about, Chester's grandmother, belonging to the land rather than the land belonging to you. She understood it now. She helped Chester break the east field in August, which was hard work even with the draft horses, because the sod was thick and deep and had never been turned, and the roots of the grass went down like a net through the soil. They worked it in strips, Chester driving the plow and she working behind it, breaking the turned sod into smaller pieces with a spade so it would dry properly. It was exhausting and satisfying in equal measure, and by the end of the first week the east field was half broken, and Elvira could no longer straighten all the way up without a discussion between her back and her determination, which her determination usually won. She was carrying their first child, though she had not yet told Chester. She had suspected for about 3 weeks. She had no doctor's confirmation, because she was between Ridgecroft and Dr. Fenwick at Horn Creek, but she had enough practical knowledge to trust what her body was telling her, and her body was telling her something clear and consistent. She told him on a Thursday evening in late August, when they were sitting on the porch in the evening after supper, in her rocking chair and him on the step. She said it the same way she had proposed to him, directly, without building up to it. He went very still. Then he turned around and looked at her. Then he stood up and took her hands and pulled her to her feet and held her carefully, as though she had become something more fragile overnight, which she had not, as she told him. She was not made of spun glass, and he did not have to treat her differently. He said, "I will try," she said. "Don't try too hard." He said into her hair in a low voice, "I am very happy, Elvira." She pressed her face against his shoulder. "So am I," she said. She went to see Dr. Fenwick in Horn Creek the following week, riding carefully on Dolly, who seemed to have an opinion about the pace, which was not so different from her usual opinion about pace. Fenwick confirmed what Elvira already knew, calculated a spring delivery, and told her to eat well and rest more than she usually did, which Elvira received as general guidance and interpreted at her own discretion. She did reduce the heavy lifting. She was not unreasonable. The autumn came again, her second autumn on this land, and it was better than the first because she knew it now. She knew the way the cottonwoods turned a particular burning gold, and the way the creek ran lower in October, and the way the mornings went from cool to cold with a sudden conviction in mid-September. Her mother could not come, because the autumn had been harder on her health than the summer, but they wrote frequently, and Elvira sent back careful, specific letters full of observations and small stories that she knew her mother liked. Chester sometimes added a line at the bottom, in his plain handwriting, just a sentence or two, "Hello to her and hope for her health and we are well," and Elvira looked at those sentences every time with a feeling she could not entirely name. Her mother wrote back once about those additions. "He writes the way a good man does, without decoration." The winter was hard in the way Nebraska winters were, which was to say it was seriously cold, and the snow came in January with real intention and stayed. They were prepared for it, the barn well supplied, the root cellar full, the woodpile substantial. Elvira had spent September and October quietly but systematically ensuring that they would not be caught short, because she had read enough about the history of the territory to know that it was the winters that caught people who had not paid attention. She and Chester spent the winter working at close quarters, which is the true test of whether two people actually suit each other. They suited each other. They had their disagreements, because both of them were strong-willed and had opinions, and were not the kind of people who stayed quiet when they thought someone was wrong. But their disagreements were honest and moved through to resolution without damage, which was what you wanted. He was reading more now. She had gotten him in the habit of it, or brought out a habit that had always been there but dormant. She would read in the evenings and sometimes read passages aloud that she thought he would find interesting, and he would listen and then talk about what he thought, and they would go back and forth about it in a way that she found deeply enjoyable, because he thought differently than she did in ways that were interesting rather than frustrating. He could read a piece of country the way she could read a piece of text, looking at the whole thing first and then going back to the detail, building a picture from evidence. He noticed what she missed, and she noticed what he missed, and between them they had a fairly comprehensive view of things. She thought about this often, that winter. What it was to be well matched. She had not expected it to feel so much like recognition. Their son was born on the first day of March 1881, on a night when the temperature had come back up from the deep cold and the sky was clear, and the stars were the winter kind, very bright and close, and the midwife Mrs. Harrow came from town in good time and things went, as such things went, with all the difficulty and power they always went with, and at the end of it there was a person in the world who had not been in the world before. Chester was outside during most of it because that was how it was done, and Elvira did what had to be done with Mrs. Harrow and with herself, which took 4 hours and was the hardest work she had ever done, which was saying something given her history with hard work. When Mrs. Harrow opened the bedroom door and told Chester he could come in, he came in with the careful step of a man walking somewhere very important, and Elvira was propped up with pillows looking. She was well aware, somewhat the worse for wear but more alive than she had felt in a long time, and she was holding a small, red-faced, furious-looking person who had apparently just decided that the world was too loud and too cold, and was not at all shy about expressing this opinion. Chester sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Elvira. "He is angry," Chester said. "He is new," Elvira said. "He will improve." Chester reached out and put one large finger against the baby's fist, which was clenched and waving, and the baby grabbed the finger with a grip that surprised Chester into a small sound. "He is strong," Chester said. "He is," Elvira said. There was a feeling in her so large that she held it very carefully, the way you hold something you know is good. "What do you want to call him?" Chester thought. "James," he said, "after my grandfather, and Thomas after yours." Elvira looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying and was now looking at Chester's finger with an expression of deep concentration. "James Thomas Norris," she said. "That is a good name." "I think so," Chester said. He looked up at her and she looked at him, and the night was silent around the house, and the stars were out over the Nebraska plains, and there was a fire in the bedroom fireplace and a lamp on the table and the smell of cedar and milk and the particular new smell of a person just entered into the world. She reached out and touched his face, and he turned his cheek into her hand. "We are good at this," she said. "We are good at most things," he said. "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. James Thomas Norris turned out to be, as his father had noted, strong. He was also loud and curious, and had Elvira's dark hair and Chester's pale green eyes, which was a combination that people remarked on with the kind of attention that both his parents found slightly excessive but endured with patience. He grew at the rate that healthy, well-fed children grow, which is to say with remarkable speed that never failed to catch his parents slightly off guard. And by the time the summer came, he was filling the house with a presence entirely out of proportion to his size. Her mother came in the summer of 1881, in July, on the train and then in a rented rig, and Elvira and Chester went out to meet her on the road 2 miles from the house because they could not wait. Her mother sat in the rig holding James Thomas for approximately 3 minutes and then burst into tears that she recovered from quickly and attributed to the dust on the road, which Elvira accepted without comment. Her mother stayed for 6 weeks, and she was thinner than the last time but brighter in the eyes, and she and Chester had long conversations on the porch in the evenings while Elvira put James Thomas to bed, and Elvira could hear the low run of their voices through the open window and felt something she thought might be the most complete she had ever felt. Her mother said, on the day before she left, in the kitchen while Elvira was making bread, "You made the right choice." Both the choices, the one about the land and the one about the man. Elvira kept her hands in the dough. "I know," she said. "You knew then," her mother said. "I think I knew before I let myself know," Elvira said. "The first night maybe, when I lay down on his floor and listened to the house and thought about the books on his shelf," her mother smiled. "What was it about the books?" Elvira thought about it. "He read them," she said. "You could see that he had read them, not to seem like a man who reads, but because he wanted to know what was in them." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Your father was like that," she said. "About building. He did not build things to prove he could. He built them because it satisfied something in him to make a thing that would stand." Elvira looked at her hands in the dough. "I know," she said again, softly. Her mother left the next day, on the train from Horn Creek, and Elvira cried for the first time in years, quietly, in the early morning before Chester woke, sitting on the porch in her rocking chair while the plains went from dark to gray to gold. Then she wiped her face and went in and made coffee and began the day. The years that followed were built year by year the way the fence was built, one solid post at a time. Chester broke the rest of the east field and planted it in wheat, and the wheat did well in the good years and adequately in the dry years, and they learned the rhythm of it, the anxiety and hope of planting, and the relief and satisfaction of harvest. He added cattle, 20 head to start and then more, a manageable number on good grass, not the massive drives he had once worked but his own, on his own land, which was worth more to him than any number. Elvira continued her work with Perkins and expanded it, because Ridgecroft was growing, and there was more and more need for someone who could keep accurate records and explain legal documents to people who had not had schooling and were trying to understand what they were signing. She did this with the same directness she applied to everything, and she took no payment from people who truly could not afford it, which Perkins had mixed feelings about but did not argue with her on, because he had learned by then that arguing with Elvira about a principle she held was not an efficient use of time. She also taught. Informally at first, and then more formally, because there were children in Ridgecroft who needed more than the part-time teacher the town could currently afford, and Elvira was there, and educated, and not willing to watch children go without learning when she could do something about it. Chester built a schoolroom addition onto the church building, which was the largest structure in town, and the whole project took 4 Saturdays and the labor of about 12 willing men and 3 kegs of good resolve. When the room was finished, Elvira stood in it and looked at the windows Chester had set precisely level, and the floor he had laid with the care of a man who had been taught by someone who believed that a good floor was a moral choice. And she thought of her father, and she thought of Chester's grandmother, and she felt the continuity of things that are built right and handed forward. They had a second child in 1883, a daughter they named Clara Rose, who arrived with considerably more efficiency than her brother had, and immediately demonstrated that she would be quieter but not less observant. Clara had Chester's coloring, blonde and pale-eyed, with her mother's expression when something interested her, which was a look of focused intensity that Chester said made her look like a miniature Elvira studying a problem. Elvira said she did not make that face. Chester said nothing, which was its own kind of response. James Thomas was 2 when Clara arrived and had opinions about the new addition that he expressed with the clarity of a person who has not yet learned to soften his conclusions. He looked at his sister for a long while and then looked at his parents and said, "She is very small." Chester confirmed that this was accurate. James said, "Will she get bigger?" Elvira said that was the general plan. He seemed to find this satisfactory and moved on, and by the following week had appointed himself her protector in the way of older brothers, which he maintained with great seriousness for the rest of his childhood. Mrs. Aldred came over when Clara was 3 days old, bringing soup and preserved peaches, and the same handkerchief she had brought to the wedding, which she had apparently designated the household handkerchief for good occasions. She held Clara and told Chester he had done well, as though the baby were a product of Chester's effort alone, which made Elvira laugh until she had to stop because laughing was still slightly ambitious. The South Road house, her aunt's old property, had by now been made into something Chester and Elvira were both proud of. They had put enough work into it over the years that it was well-maintained and genuinely pretty, with a tidy garden and a new coat of paint on the clapboard, and the porch she had rebuilt in her first weeks here gleaming and sound. They rented it to a young couple named Braddock who had come west in 1882 with 1 horse, 1 cow, and a determination that Elvira respected, and she helped them understand the land documents and Chester helped the husband with fencing technique, and the Braddocks became friends in the way of neighbors who start as strangers and become something more through the shared business of making a life. Her mother died in the autumn of 1884, in Wichita, quietly, in the early morning, which was what Elvira had hoped for her when hope was still reasonable, and what she felt grateful for when the letter arrived. She had been back to Wichita once since her marriage in 1882, taking the train with James Thomas, who was 1 year old and apparently an excellent train traveler, and she had spent 3 weeks with her mother, and the time had been good in the particular way of time that you are aware, while you are in it, is precious. She held the letter for a long time before she told Chester. When she told him, he said nothing. He put his arms around her and held her, and she stood with her face against his chest for a long while, and then she cried properly this time without trying to manage it. He said nothing, which was what she needed. He held her until she was done. After she sat at the kitchen table with tea and he sat across from her and she said, she was here long enough to know this was right. She held James and she knew Clara was coming. That is enough. It is, Chester said, more than some people get. Yes, Elvira said. She would say the same. She went to Wichita to settle her mother's affairs because there was no one else to do it and because she was who she was. Chester went with her because there was no question of anything else, and they left the children with Mrs. Aldred, who treated the arrangement as an occasion to be relished rather than a burden, and they went together. They were gone 12 days. They settled the house, which was sold, and her mother's small collection of things, which were distributed as her mother had requested, with some pieces going to her mother's church and a few books and a quilt, and a certain painting of the Kansas plains in summer going back on the train with Elvira. She hung the painting in the main room of their house, between the bookshelf and the window, where it could be seen from the table. Chester looked at it for a while when she put it up. He said, "It looks like our land." "It looks like all this land," she said. "That is what I love about it." He put his arm around her shoulders and they looked at the painting together, and outside the window the actual land stretched away in the evening light, the wheat field and the east pasture and the creek line with its cottonwoods gone gold in the late October afternoon, and it looked, she thought, like something her mother would have been glad to see. There was a night in the late autumn of 1884 when Chester came in from the barn late, having stayed to sit with one of the mares who was having a difficult time, and Elvira had kept supper warm and was reading at the table, and James was asleep and Clara was asleep and the house was quiet except for the fire. Chester sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a while. She looked at him. "The mare, she will be all right," he said. "Foal came in the end, small but good." "Good," she said. A silence, the fire cracked. "Elvira," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know something," he said. He looked up. He had that expression she knew now, the one that preceded him saying something he had been thinking about for a while. "I think about that night sometimes. The storm, you knocking on the door, I think about how it could have gone differently so many ways. I could have not answered, you could have kept writing." She set her book down. "But you answered," she said, "and I stopped. I think about what it would look like, my life," he said slowly, "if those things had not happened, and I cannot actually imagine it. The house feels like you are part of it now. The land does too." She looked at him across the table, this man she had married, who built her a rocking chair because he had watched how she sat and who had held her without needing to fill the silence with words and who had written careful, plain lines at the bottom of letters to her mother, and who had given the Hobeck family corn without making talk about it. She said, "You never asked me to leave." He said, "I never wanted to." She reached across the table and took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers. Outside, the autumn night settled over the land, over the 400 acres that had never once asked them anything except that they pay attention, over the wheat field and the east pasture and the creek line with its cottonwoods, over the barn where a new foal was figuring out the world, over the garden where the last of the season's plants were gone to frost and seed, over everything they had built and everything they were building still. She thought about the pump in the first hours of that first night, and the chair and the damper, and how the bucket had caught the drip from the ceiling with a clear, small ring. She thought about how sometimes the thing that changes everything looks, from the outside, like nothing at all, like just a practical woman noticing what needs doing in the dark. She thought about belonging to a place. She thought about her father's hands and her mother's eyes and Chester's grandmother's words, and the way the light came through the window in the mornings here. She looked at Chester's face in the firelight and he looked at hers, and there was nothing unfinished between them, nothing left unsaid that mattered, nothing incomplete. "I need to check on the foal in the morning," she said. "We will go together," he said. "All right," she said. She got up and turned the lamp down, and the firelight took the room, and they went to bed in the quiet of the plains night with the sound of the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek. And the house stood against it, the way a well-built house stands, without protest, without strain, just there, solid and sound, around the life that had been made inside it. In the spring of 1885, the schoolroom that Chester had helped build was given an official teacher, a young woman named Miss Edith Cross, who came from Ohio with a teaching certificate and a trunk of books and a determination that Elvira recognized and liked immediately. Elvira handed over the informal teaching with the efficiency of a person who knows when to step back, and spent the transition helping Miss Cross understand the particular character of the children she would be working with, which took about 2 evenings, and was some of the most useful time Elvira had put in all year. James Thomas started proper school that fall. He was 4, going on 40, with his father's way of looking at things carefully before he committed an opinion to them, and his mother's way of not letting go once he had decided what he thought. He walked to the schoolroom on his first day with his chin up and his hands in his pockets and looked back once at Elvira, who was standing at the gate, and she waved. He turned around and walked on. She stood at the gate for a while after he disappeared inside. Chester came and stood beside her. "He will be fine," Chester said. "I know he will," she said. "You are the one I'm not sure about," Chester said gently. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I am fine." "You are," he agreed. "But you cannot watch him go like that and not feel it." She was quiet. "No," she said, "you cannot." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, just briefly, before she straightened up and began thinking about what needed doing today, which was a great deal. It was always a great deal, and that was exactly the way she liked it. Clara grew up with the land in her in a way that was different from James, but no less complete. She would sit in the kitchen garden for an hour at a stretch, watching insects with a focused patience that was entirely her father's. She asked questions constantly, not the kind of questions that wanted reassurance, but the kind that wanted actual answers. And Elvira gave her actual answers always, because she believed in that without reservation. By 1887, the wheat was consistently good. The herd was 60 head, and Chester had bought the parcel to the north that bordered his fence line, adding another 100 acres to the property. Elvira's work with the land records and documents had grown into something that the county itself had taken notice of, and there was a formal conversation with the county land office in Lincoln about whether she might consider a consulting role, which she considered for 3 weeks and then accepted on her own terms, which were specific about her hours and her independence, and which the county, after brief negotiation, agreed to. She was 34 years old and she was not finished with things yet, not by a long way. Chester was 40. He had more gray in his hair than the day she had arrived at his door in a storm, and his hands were more worked, and there was a history in his face that was the history of a man who had spent many years outdoors doing real things, and she loved his face so much that sometimes it surprised her, even after 8 years of marriage, the simple physical fact of it. He felt the same way about her. She knew this not because he said it often, though he said it sometimes, but because of the 1,000 small ways a person's attention reveals what they value. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He remembered what she had said casually about things months later when those things came up again. He read books she had read and came to tell her what he thought about them, not to impress her, but because he genuinely wanted to know if she agreed. He had never once in 8 years made her feel that her competence was a problem or her directness was something to be managed. That was, she had come to believe, rarer than it should be. She had known women in Ridgecroft and in the territory who had married men who found capable women threatening, who wore their marriages like something slightly too small, who had learned to make themselves less in order to make their husbands comfortable. She did not judge those women. She knew why they did it, and she knew the world that made it necessary. But she was grateful, in a way that went down to the bone, that she had knocked on Chester's door instead of someone else's. She thought about this sometimes, the randomness of it, the single element of chance in a night of rain and a lit window and a man who opened the door. She thought about how differently her life might have been arranged. And then she stopped thinking about it, because it was not a useful line of thought, and because what actually happened was good enough that speculation in other directions was both unnecessary and ungrateful. In the autumn of 1888, James Thomas was 7, and in school and deeply interested in horses in the way that some children are interested in things with an intensity that is clearly going to be permanent. He was already good on horseback, better than good, with a natural ease that made Chester quietly proud in the way he was quietly proud of things, without making speeches about it. Clara was 5 and had started school and had taken one look at Miss Cross's collection of books and clearly decided that this was the right place for her. Elvira was expecting again. She had known for 6 weeks and had taken her time deciding when to say something, not because she was uncertain, but because she liked holding a thing in herself for a little while before it became a shared thing. This was a private habit she had, and Chester knew about it and did not press her on it. She told him on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the porch in the last warm light of September, with the children inside and the rocking chair creaking gently and the sound of the creek in the distance. He looked at her, the same look he had looked at her with in the kitchen in 1880, surprised into happiness. When, he said, "March," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. Then he said, "James and Clara are going to have a lot of opinions." "James will take it in stride," she said. "Clara will want to know everything about how it works." "She is yours," Chester said. "She is ours," Elvira corrected. He smiled. It was a full smile, one of the ones that arrived without announcement and changed his whole face, the one she had seen more and more often over 8 years, and which still struck her with the same force they always had. "What do you want this time?" he said. "A healthy one," she said, the same thing she had said each time. "Me too," he said, and then, "if it is a boy, I was thinking Samuel. After your father, after my grandfather who I never met," he said. "My father told me about him. He built boats in Georgia before everything. He could look at a piece of wood and tell you what it wanted to be." Elvira was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father, the carpenter. She thought about Chester's grandmother with her words about belonging to the land. She thought about all the people who had handed things forward to the people sitting on this porch in the September evening. "Samuel," she said, "and I want the middle name to be Henry. After nobody in particular. I just like it." Chester said, "Samuel Henry Norris." Elvira said, "Yes." The baby was born in early March of 1889, and he was Samuel Henry, and he was born into a house that knew how to hold people, that had been built and tended and fixed and kept by 2 people who understood that a good thing requires constant attention, and he arrived into arms that were ready. James Thomas took one look at his new brother and said, with 7-year-old gravity, "He looks like me." Clara, 5 years old, said, "He looks like all of us." She said it with the authority of a person who had given the matter careful thought. Elvira looked at her daughter and felt a specific, shining pride. Chester held the baby and looked at him for a long while, and then he looked at Elvira, and the look between them had the whole history of 9 years in it. The storm and the door and the pump and the chair and the fire damper and the fence line and the wheat field and the children asleep in the next room and the books on the shelf, and the painting of the Kansas plains, and every morning that had come and gone in this house. "We have done well," Chester said. "We have," Elvira said. "We will keep doing well," he said, not a question. "We will," she said, same certainty, same direction. Outside the window, the Nebraska plains stretched away under the early March sky, still pale and cold, with the first thin suggestion of spring in the way the light lay on the land. The creek was running with melt water. In a few weeks the cottonwoods would bud and the wheat field would have to be prepared, and the garden would need turning, and there would be 100 things to do, 1,000 things to do, because that was what land was and what life was, and neither of them had ever wanted anything different. Chester had a bookshelf with 30 books the first night. It had nearly 70 now. Some of them were hers, some were his, some had been given by people in town, some had been bought at the general store or brought back from trips to the larger towns. The books were read and reread and talked about and argued over and sometimes read aloud in the evenings, and James Thomas had started working his way through them with a method, starting at the left and going to the right, which was very much his mother's approach. The porch she had built held solid and true. The pump ran smooth. The fireplace drew clean and straight. The chair with the shim under the left rear leg had eventually given way to a newer chair, properly made, but she had kept the shim in the small compartment of the tool box, wrapped in a piece of cloth, because some things you keep. She kept it. She kept all of it, the whole of it, every morning and evening of it, every year of it, the good years and the hard years and the ordinary years that were better than they looked from the outside, the whole accumulating weight of a life built deliberately, with good materials, on ground that was worth the effort. The storm that brought her to his door had been the end of October, 1879. On the last day of October, 1889, they sat on the porch in the evening while the children slept inside, Samuel in his cradle, James and Clara in their beds, with the lantern between them and the plains dark and enormous around the house and the stars out the way they got in autumn, extraordinary and close. 10 years. Chester said, "Do you remember the storm?" "I remember all of it," she said. "What did you think of me?" he said. When I opened the door, she thought about it honestly. "I thought you were careful," she said, "and that you had good hands, and that you had been working late, which meant you were not afraid of work. And I thought the house smelled of cedar and wood smoke and coffee, and that was a sign of someone who took care of their things." He looked at her. "That is a great deal to think in the moment of a door opening." "I notice things quickly," she said. "You do," he agreed. "What else?" She looked at him. "I thought you had an honest face," she said, "and that you were not afraid of what was standing on your porch even though you had every reason to be cautious." He was quiet. "What did you think of me?" she said. He took his time. "I thought you were not asking to be rescued," he said. "I thought you were asking for something specific, shelter and a place for your horse, and you had your terms ready and you meant them. I thought most people in that situation would have been afraid, and you were not. You were cold and wet and tired, but you were not afraid," she said. "I was a little afraid." "I know," he said, "but not of me." "No," she said, "not of you." The night was still and full around them. Samuel made a small sound from inside the house and then settled back into sleep. A horse shifted in the barn. The creak murmured in the dark. Chester reached across and took her hand, the way he had done 1,000 times, and she held his hand, the way she had held it 1,000 times, and the night went on around them, wide and dark and full of stars. Over everything they had built, over everything that was still growing, over the land that belonged to them and to which they belonged, out to the edge of the dark and beyond it to wherever the stars went when morning came. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.